Welcome to this week's episode of The Deep Dive. We are in our series called It Runs in the Family, where we are looking at what it means to be the church. We're looking at different one another statements found in the New Testament and applying those to our own specific place culturally. And so I'm joined today, my name is Brad, I'm joined by lead pastor, Pastor Terry, and Pastor Ben Powers, our ministry team director. And so how are you guys doing today? We've had, we're in this about halfway through this series now. Where we've kind of, we started with love one another, and then it was honor one another, bear with one another, and this week we're looking at what it means to forgive.
Bearing and forgiving.
They go together.
Yeah. I'm loving this. I mean, I generally love every series that we do, some more than others, but I really do kind of get into it. And I think, who are we? Who is the church? When people come into our sphere of influence, what should they experience, and do they experience kind of a warm, loving nature? They experience patience and kindness as opposed to resentment and I'm about me. Yeah. So I'm really always hopeful that this sinks deep and it becomes part of our DNA and who we are.
Yeah. And Ben, I know you write small group questions every single week. Yeah. What have you been hearing from small groups just around this series?
Yeah, I mean, I think this series is great because it really is opposite of what we see in our culture and what people are experiencing. So it's great that people can come in and talk about, here's what the church should look like, here's what we should experience, here's the benefit that we receive and what we get to do.
Yeah. So cool. So last week, you kind of already alluded to this. We looked at this idea of what it means to bear with one another. Obviously, lots of people that we are called to bear with, but they're called to bear with us. Right. I think this week we're going to see some parallels, right, with the whole what it means to forgive others and be people who have been forgiven, who need to be forgiven. But
I think it's the same reminder that life is difficult. I think, as Ben says, in our culture, I think it's more and more condemning, and we don't give you a second chance, and it's my way, and I'm not going to put up with this anymore. But that church is a place. It's not easy. Small groups are not sometimes easy. People hurt each other. They wound each other. I mean, our staff, I think, are a mini church, and that's, we bear with each other. People have to bear with me and my idiosyncrasies and my decisions and learning to get along, and that hopefully trickles down to other people. But it's not easy always.
Yeah. Ben, for small groups, this last, I know as since we've started this deep dive project, right, we've done this within this context of a pandemic happening. As one of the reasons we've done this is we want to provide more digital content for people in our community to just learn and to walk together. But what have you seen with small groups? So specifically last week, bear with one another. This week, forgive one another. Where have you seen that go really well? Where have you seen that been, where groups may be struggling a bit?
Yeah, well, it definitely, small groups, it's so relational. And I think with small groups, it's, who's there is who's there. So you don't really get to pick always who's going to be there. So
and that's the church, right?
That's the church. Yeah. I mean, you're kind of forced to bear with, you're kind of forced to encourage. And it's true. It's kind of like what Terry was talking about, where, these are things that we have to learn. It's not going to be perfect. Small groups aren't going to be perfect. The church isn't going to be perfect, but the Bible's honest about that, and the Bible gives us some direction and here's how you do this, and here's how this works. So it's not just some fairy tale. It's not easy. Relationships aren't easy. So
yeah, even in our culture, I think what you said, we try, and I'm going to pick a church for me. I'm going to pick a church that fits my needs. I'm going to pick a church where I can have friends. And so we have more of a luxury in our culture of being able to kind of pick a church that we think will be what we want it to be. But then it's people, and so we still end up hurting and wounding and frustrating other people. But that's how God works in our life and uses us and shapes us. And we are called not just to be individual, but we are called to be a community of people that does things differently than the world, to be a witness for Christ.
Yeah, I think, reading through the epistles, in New Testament times, there's the church in Ephesus, that's it. There's no other church you can go to. So they had to bear with. Yeah. They had to learn how to do it. They had to learn how to love, or else, you have no other options. But I do think in our culture, there are options, but when people go to those other options, I think they find, well, there are the same components here. And I do have to learn to encourage and bear and love and forgive others within every community you go to.
We talked about this a couple weeks ago. We were looking at honor one another, right? And kind of, I think it was Chris who was talking about the different cultural differences, right? For us in a Western place compared to, more of an Eastern environment where honor and shame is real prevalent. Here, it's guilt, it's individualism. That's kind of how we wrap up our identity. And so I do wonder if bearing with and forgiving maybe had they took on a different level of importance or something in the context in the early church, because there was only one church, but also the way you did relationship with one another, like that was your identity. Like you were either in the group or you're not in the group. And everyone wants to avoid shame. Everyone wants to avoid bringing dishonor to the group or to the group level there. But at the same time, Terry, you say this all the time, right? People are people. Whether
church is church.
Church is church, right? Whether it's first century, ancient Near East, or whether it's 21st century,
or 3998 Mid Rivers Mall Drive.
Yes, church.
It's to say that I know I keep working in the back of my mind when the sermon series is great church fights, because there's some great church fights in the New Testament. And I've always said my last sermon series, and then I'll be gone, is Christians behaving badly. Like looking at Scripture where Christians, they don't live the way we would expect. Yeah. And we should have realistic expectations of how Christ followers live, but we are still broken people. And that's why I think this part in the middle of this One Another series is, are we, as we talk about, are we forgivers? And I think, talking in the first century, that was not an idea. You're not a forgiver. You might mete out a bit of forgiveness, but Jesus' forgiveness makes us forgivers. That's part of our identity.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. All right, well, let's dive in. So Colossians chapter 3. We looked at Colossians 3. We looked at Matthew 18. And so I want to spend maybe a little bit more time in Colossians 3. But then, Matthew 18, here you have Jesus giving this radical new vision for forgiveness to his disciples. And so with that as well. But Colossians chapter 3, so verses, starting in verse 12, put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. So it's a classic, Paul going through these just different virtues. You see this in a lot of his letters where he just kind of lists virtue. And then oftentimes within these lists, there are ways that he writes it and crafts it that, make you focus on, items in the list that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see. And I think we see that here in verse 13, bearing with one another. And if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you. So you also must forgive. And then he continues to say, and above these, put on love. So we have this phrase here, forgiving each other. And it's assumed, right? Like there's not something that's like, oh yeah, and if you forgive, right? He said, no. If one has a complaint, forgive each other. Like that's kind of a requirement for being this new people, this new covenant people of God. And so I guess just at very just face value, like what is forgiveness? This is something that I've been wrestling with. I've got, two toddlers, and we're trying to teach them how to, apologize and forgive. So James, he'll push his sister down, and so we'll, hey, you go to timeout. When timeout's over, you go to her, you apologize, you say, I'm sorry, you ask if she'll forgive you. Bren, you forgive him. They hug, but at the end of the day, he'll do it, another time. So it's like there is something there that I think as Christ followers, forgiveness is something that we need to practice and we need to do. But I guess, I don't know, that as a parent, I'm wondering, what is forgiveness? Just that very just root at its core. What does it mean to forgive someone?
I think what's interesting with the passage is, Paul starts off saying, put on. These are things that we have to put on because these aren't natural things. Yeah. We don't do this naturally. It doesn't come out naturally. And I've had young kids. I have kids now, and you're starting to see it with your kids. This isn't just a natural thing. This has to be taught, and it's part of our fallen nature. it's probably part of what we learn in culture and what we see. But I think the start of forgiveness is understanding that, we just don't do this naturally. This isn't our first response to an offense or anything. And so this is something that is learned. And I think these are things that once when we learn them, they go well for us because when it does come to forgiveness, those who are not willing or not able to, then they're stuck with hurt, offense, bitterness, things that are really going to, we might even say, rot the soul. Yeah. And it's almost, this is Jesus' way of saying, here, I want you to live free. I want you to have a good life, and I don't want you to harbor bitterness, and because it will destroy you. So I think an understanding of that first is helpful.
So something that is not so forgiveness, maybe first bullet point, right? Forgiveness is something that is not natural for us.
Yeah, and Jesus talks a lot. I mean, even in the Lord's Prayer, it's give us this day, every day, our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those. So I do tend to think that there's a daily aspect to our bread, but also a daily aspect to forgiveness, to wake up in the morning and say, okay, I've got to put my forgiver identity on. I think at the very kind of basic, forgiveness is really canceling a debt. So when someone forget, it's like the debt has been canceled, which is Jesus on the cross. It is finished, was the debt is canceled. It's paid. We don't owe God anything. Jesus paid it. And so I think at the root, forgiveness, and with little kids, is somebody does something to me, so I'm going to make it right. They owe me something, or I'm going to hurt them back. So typically with kids, it's like, okay, someone takes my toy, so I'm going to take their toy, or I'm going to poke them in the eye, or I'm going to do something to try to even the scale.
Yeah, that registers.
Yeah. So forgiveness says, but basically, forgiveness always is a cost. It costs Jesus. Forgiveness costs something, and it's like, okay, I'm going to cancel the debt. They don't owe me. And it's really funny. I mean, I look at times in my life, and I think I've shared some of these publicly, like where someone has hurt me or wounded me or said things. And, in my head, I imagine that there's going to be some day when they are going to come and they're going to profusely apologize and they're going to give me a trip to the Caribbean or something.
So we're always hoping for, right?
We're always hoping, right, to even it up. They owe me, they owe me apology, which I think is true. Sure. They do owe that. But they're going to owe me some recompense for that. And the longer, I think, as Ben was saying, the longer we hold on to the bitterness and the hurt, the debt the more they have to pay, because we're letting that take so much more. And so we're hoping that they're going to do that. And as we talked about, kind of forgiving the person for our sake, it's like, okay, they don't owe me, right? And then if they do come with an apology, we forgive them for their sake because they're coming. But that's what forgiveness is. They don't owe me anymore. Yeah. And I'm just canceling the debt. And I'm not going to wait. I'm not going to try to hurt them. I'm not going to try to do what they do to them. I'm just going to cancel the debt. And as we talk, we can talk a bit more, but that doesn't necessarily say the relationship's going to go back the way it was or everything's the same. It's that forgiveness is there, and then the opportunity for restoration occurs. But I'm not going to wait around, or I'm not going to hold you back because you owe me something. It's canceled. And again, as Jesus paid it, we have to pay the cost. There's a cost. That's why forgiveness is hard, because it costs us.
I think too, it's it is an intellectual act, but it's an emotional act as well. I mean, because when we're offended, when we're hurt, I think sometimes in Christian world, it's, well, you need to forgive. So Jesus forgave you. So it's this intellectual transaction where, okay, so I'll just forgive. But there's this emotional process of grieving the hurt and feeling that and understanding what happened and letting that soak in and let God minister to us in that. And then the act of understanding his forgiveness and being able to release somebody and release what they've done. So,
yeah, I think we had a great conversation in our teaching team meeting in preparation for the message. And, that sometimes intellectually it's like we forgive too quickly. It's like, I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to deal with the problem. And we forget. And then emotionally, we have, forgiver's remorse. Like, I shouldn't have done that. So it hasn't really sunk in or I may need to have a conversation or I may need to unpack some of what that person has really done.
And part of your sermon is being honest with God and telling God, this is what happened, this is what's going on, and just kind of being real with the offense and everything that's taken place. Like that's a part of the equation with it.
Yeah. And I think a situation a while back, someone apologized for something, and it was something that was a while back, and I was caught off guard and didn't really want to probably engage further in the conversation. But it was like, at the moment, it didn't strike me. And then when I hung up from talking with them, I was like, oh, wait a minute. I probably should have just unpacked some more, or for the sake of restoring the relationship. Like, I had forgiven. There was nothing. But it was like, oh, I think I should have unpacked some things to help restore the relationship. I too quickly kind of shut that down.
So in Colossians, Paul says, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, put on compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. What do those traits have to do with the ability to bear with and to forgive?
Well, it's interesting. 3 of them are the same as in Ephesians, right? Or kind of kindness, gentleness, humility, and patience, right? They're all part of the character of Jesus. They're all part of what love is. Love is patient, love is kind, love bears no record of wrongs. So they're all part of just the character of Jesus. And it's not about who are we. In the sense of humility and patience is the one another part. That's central to being one another with people and to deal with people well.
Yeah, no, I think that's so good, and kind of points to what you were saying earlier, Ben, about these are things that we don't do naturally. Like even these traits, right? Being compassionate, being kind, being humble, being meek, being patient. Like those are not natural virtues, right? I
mean, revenge, anger, bitterness. Those are all spiritual gifts for a lot of us. So.
Not for you, Ben.
Not for me.
But I do love here what Paul's doing, because then he roots forgiving each other, right? As the Lord has forgiven you must also forgive. So I want to take just kind of a moment, like we've talked on the deep dive before, justification, sanctification, like these different kind of things. But like at the core, like when someone puts their faith in Jesus, like what is happening? Like what are we doing there? What does it mean to be forgiven?
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly our debt has been canceled. I mean, I think when we hurt someone, when something's taken from us, we naturally think they owe me, right? They owe me. If they gossip about me, they owe me something. They owe my reputation back. They owe me if they take something. They owe me. And so I think that's natural, even subconsciously in our relationship with God, that we owe God something. So we spend our life trying to pay penance, trying to do something to prove that we are okay. So that's there. We are loved, forgiven. There's no debt. We have nothing to pay off. And what also happens is, Christ comes in and our spiritual life change. We become alive. We become the part that died when sin came into the world is now alive. So there's a new power and aliveness in Christ. That's the power of the gospel. And, as we talk, it's not us trying harder or doing it. It's like, oh, I've got to be more forgiving. Oh, I got to try. I got to like them. I got to bear. It's that we have the Spirit of Jesus alive in us, who's changing us from the inside out. And we can rest in, okay, if he's canceled my debt, this is the one, then, okay, help me cancel that debt that someone owes me. Help me to Jesus, you do that. And that's the Matthew 18 parable is we often probably minimize what we've been forgiven of because we don't think 100%. We're that bad.
Right.
Right. I'm better than that person who just hurt me.
Yeah, we've got a little sin problem that Jesus is taking care of, but when it comes
I'm not Hitler, so I'm okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
No, I think the other part of this is just understanding that God is a just God. He's right and to judge. He's right and to do that. And sometimes we we think he just sweeps things under the rug and it doesn't matter. So there's
It's
big
really good
things
then.
that he really does care about. There's small things that that we do that's like, it's not a big deal. But the truth is, he's a really good judge, and we would want that. I mean, we don't want to worship a God who just looks at injustice and turns a blind eye to it. We want a God who looks at injustice and says, wait a second, there's a problem, and I'm gonna do something about it. And so I think we all want justice, but obviously when it's ourselves, it's hard for us to see that. It's hard for us to really maybe admit.
Well, that's how God does justice, right? Almost the economy of the kingdom. One of the currencies in that economy is forgiveness. And so even on the cross, like God, Jesus goes to the cross. It wasn't just God says, okay, yeah, you're forgiven. Like there was something that happened, right? Jesus, his sacrifice on the cross, is what leads to us being able to essentially be granted the status of forgiven.
Right. Yeah, we don't imagine giving our child away, becoming, separating. It costs.
Yeah.
Forgiveness always
It always
costs.
costs. It always costs.
I do think too, with the question, it is the forgiveness that we're able to receive that really opens the door to this life that God is wanting. And when we read through those things, this is what He's inviting us to, and to think about a life of kindness and gentleness and humility, being able to forgive, being able to love, being able to encourage. Like I think everybody would say, we're all trying to do that. Whether that's with God or without God, but everybody's trying to improve, to try to become, we want those things in our life. And I think that's the invitation that God gives to us. And we sometimes miss that, where it's Christianity is a set of rules, but it's not. It's an invitation to a life that we really do desire. Yeah. We really do want.
Which is really getting, to Peter and Jesus, their interaction, which didn't spend as much time. Peter says, how many times should I forgive? And he said 7, because in Jewish culture, you only had to forgive 3 times. I mean, you were so conscious of how many, a person hurts me, and I'm going to only forgive 3 times. Peter's being magnanimous, 7, that's the perfect number, is that, that's double and more. And Jesus says 7 times 70, which it's really just, it becomes our identity. It's a lifestyle. It's who we are, that we're not like, oh, should I forgive? Have I forgiven enough? What should I do? It's like, we are forgivers. Now, that doesn't mean we let people walk all over us again. It does mean people don't have consequences for what pain they have.
Yeah.
But that we are canceling that debt. We're not going to hold that for ourselves. We're not going to imprison ourselves in pain and bitterness. Because
I want to go back there, right? So Old Testament, there was a system in place, right, for even what it looked like, what was required for forgiveness, right? If you if your cow, right, kills somebody, right?
Yeah.
Like there are requirements then, or what you're supposed to do with that cow. And so when Peter asks Jesus, and he probably thinks he's being radical, and he's like teacher's pet in a way, and he says like, oh, should we do it 7 times? And Jesus, he turns it on
its head.
head. So what, I guess, culture of forgiveness in first century early church, pre even the cross, so not even early church, but in Judaism, like what would Peter and the other disciples expect the answer to Jesus' question have been?
Well, I think he would have expected Jesus would have like, hey, Peter, that's
good job.
Good,
wow, you are great
job.
at this.
I mean, it's kind of like the Sabbath, how the rabbis through time had dissected the Sabbath, which can do, what was work, what was not, what was advantageous to you, and what was, done to the same kind of forgiveness, the eye for an eye kind of thing. What does that do? When do you have to do it? But I think it was a very punitive, not forgiving culture. They're trying, you see people trying to test Jesus, trying to put him in a corner, trying to make him fail. I think that permeated kind of the culture. And so for Peter, it was like, wow. The other disciples are like probably going, oh yeah, Peter gets the gold star today, and Jesus blows him out of the water.
Well, just before we finish, what are some things that make forgiveness difficult for us? And what are some things that I would even say as a church, as a people of God, what are some things that we need to be maybe more intentional to be quick to forgive and quick to ask forgiveness for?
I think it's just hard because we don't want to pay the cost. I think, as Ben said, from the head to the heart. We just it is a cost when we have to come to grips with we're not going to get what we want, and that person may not be able to get it. And I think that's kind of the odd thing. We hold unforgiveness to a person who can't give us what we really want. They can't restore fully what we think has been taken away. And so it's kind of a false thing. It's like, well, we want them to pay, but they will never be able to do it and can't do it.
I think too, it takes work. I mean, this is something we have to work on and we have to do. And the more I've thought about forgiveness, the more I've thought it's not always just a one-time thing. Like, people are going to hear this sermon, and it's not like they'll just go out and say, I forgive, and be done with it.
Yeah.
Because things will resurface, emotions will resurface, hurt will resurface, and then people have to go through that again and say, okay, I have to forgive this. So I think it's a process, and to look at it that way. And obviously, there's probably some things that we can just say, oh yeah, I can forgive and I can move on. Other things though are they're deep. They're deep wounds. Yeah. And so it's the deeper the wound, the harder work it's going to take for that. And so I think just understanding that as we go through our life, there's so many other things happening, responsibilities, that to think this is something I need to pay attention to. This is something that I, should check my heart, and that I have to work on and to forgive people.
Yeah.
So.
Well, even like in neurology, right? Like every time you remember something, they say that that's a new event, right? It's not like you're just downloading that video file and remembering it. Like every time you remember it, it's a new event. And so if you remember it in a certain way, you're wiring yourself to have a certain experience, to remember it in a certain way. It's a new thing. And I do wonder if there's something with forgiveness we can learn there, of like every time you recall, like just because like what you were saying, if you forgive somebody, that doesn't mean that you're done. Like you forgave somebody in that moment, but like you're going to remember that thing again, and you're going to have to forgive them again for that.
Right.
Like it is a process.
Yeah.
Okay. So as the church, right? Like we've seen in recent years, especially, like different denominations will come out and they will apologize for a stance on slavery, or a stance on I don't know, this, that, or the other. I guess like as the church, and this is, I don't even know if we have time to fully dive into this, but I guess apologies. What is the relationship between apologizing for something and like forgiveness? Or is there? Is apology required?
Well, I think to forgive the other person, we have to forgive our relationship with God. We have to forgive and choose not to hold on to that. We have to forgive, but then another person. Apology really comes when we realize we need to repent or change or do something, or that something is grievous and we have hurt people. So, hopefully that's genuine and real, and how we've done that.
Is it Moses who asked God forgiveness for the people, or I guess that's what I was thinking, and I don't know if that's maybe what we're talking about, but the idea of maybe we have people that will come into the church and they're hurt by the church, and to have somebody, sometimes I would just say, oh, I'm so sorry that happened. I so sorry, we as a church, did that, and just having a representative, a pastor even to say, I'm sorry on behalf of, our church, can be healing.
I think we need to probably be better at using words intentionally, right? Like understanding when I say I'm sorry, what is that? Like that's an expression of sorrow, right? It doesn't necessarily, like we say it all the time, but it's like I'm acknowledging that is a sorrowful experience, apologizing. I have done something that has hurt you, and I'm asking for forgiveness. As well. All right. Well, hey, we again, we ended.
That's a whole. That would be a great one to take.
Yeah, maybe that'll be a one-off deep dive here.
Christians behaving badly. We'll save it to us.
Yes. Anyway, well, thank you for joining us for this week's deep dive. You can find this resource and more on our website or our YouTube channel, website calvary.church/itrunsinthefamily, and we look forward to connecting with you again next week.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive, a Calvary Church Media Productions podcast. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts.